You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and now it's time for the Paranormal Peep Show.
Good evening, good morning, and welcome wherever you are. This is the Hapanmo Show on Hapanmo Radio and the Paranormal Peep Show on the UK Paranormal Radio Network. My name is Ben Emlyn-Jones, and I'm joined by, I'm co-hosting this, but I'm also introducing it, Neil Ward, who you're familiar with. Hello, Neil. How are you doing?
Hello, Ben. Hello, Hapanmo viewers, and hello, Paranormal UK Radio Network viewers or listeners. And I'm Neil from the Paranormal Peep Show. And we've obviously discussed with you, Ben, as a guest on our show. So it's about time I thought I'd come and re-guest again once on yours.
Oh, you're always welcome, Neil. And you know what? We have a very interesting gentleman to speak to today. It is Stephen Sakellarios. And he's going to tell us all about himself and what he does. So, Stephen, welcome. How are you?
Very good. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. So, to begin with, just perhaps you could introduce yourself and the kind of things you do, and be very interesting to hear from you.
Well, my interest is kind of twofold, but for our purposes, it's reincarnation. And I have a master's in counseling, first of all. I've studied Eastern mysticism for something over 50 years, so those are my qualifications. And I produced a documentary on reincarnation called In Another Life, Reincarnation in America. That was released in 2003, and it's still being distributed to universities. So I released that in 2003, and a couple years later, I ran across what I thought might be a past life of my own. And this was a 19th century American writer named Matthew Whittier. Looks almost exactly like me. But when I looked at the picture, I just kind of stumbled on his engraving online. And looking into the eyes, I said, I'm looking at myself. It was a very strong experience and a recognition. So, you know, for a while, I got some information on him. There's one biography, his astute thesis, and some literature. His brother was famous, John Greenleaf Whittier, the Quaker poet, so I could get a little information from there. But Matthew was the little brother, and he's really given short shrift in that biography. He's really looked down on as kind of the black sheep of the Whittier family, and I didn't feel that was right. So I started researching it. In 2009, I said, I'm going to start using all the methods that I learned when I was producing my documentary. I'm going to combine them all, and I'm going to use them to research my own case as rigorously as I can. And I did. And what I found was that not only was I able to prove that that was myself in the past life, which I can talk about my methods for that, but I also found that he had quite a literary legacy, which was forgotten and buried in the historical record because he'd published everything anonymously. He'd hid himself, and all kinds of people had falsely claimed his work and plagiarized his work. And scholars also had said, well, I don't know, this is a really good piece of work. I don't know who it belonged to, but let's assign it to this guy. You know, they're very sloppy with that, which very much surprised me. But if one scholar somewhere on very fragile basis decides that that was, you know, so-and-so's work, then everybody, once it's in print, everybody signs off on that, and they all believe that that's absolute fact, and you can't question it, you know. So anyway, I found this legacy, excuse me, that was really quite remarkable, and some of these pieces were plagiarized by famous authors. So that's where I lose everybody. Everybody assumes I have to be a fruitcake because I claim that in a past life, I was the one that wrote these famous pieces. So that makes me somewhat controversial.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, on the subject of reincarnation, this is a extraordinary claim, but it does seem to have a lot to back up in many cases. This is the idea that we as people, even though we are ourselves and we have our own personalities and our own identity, that at some point in the past, some part of us, the soul or the consciousness or whatever, actually lived as another person. In some cases, it is actually in the past. Other people have memories of existences in other worlds, other universes, even as other beings. But it's incredible the amount of evidence there is for this. It's extraordinary, memories and things like that. But so I'd like to come on to how you came to this conclusion and how you worked this out. But first of all, Neil, do you want to say anything? Yep. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I'll just say, when we scheduled this original interview, I mean, this was backtracking slightly here. When we scheduled this original interview with Stephen, it was going to be for maybe a month or two down the road, and we were going to have another lady talking about her poltergeist experiences from a long time ago, and she wanted to be anonymous. And but literally dialogue over email to sort of arrange dates and things, it suddenly kicked off again for her, and she said, I can't go through with this simply because talking about it is setting off all this poltergeist activity. So it's interesting just from that point on that it's almost like someone or something doesn't want her to proceed and is trying to control her, which I thought was interesting. But we can come more back to the psychic stuff and maybe the mediumship things later on. I know that in previous interviews with Stephen, we discussed about kind of the techniques and things, Stephen, and also that you believe that Matthew Whittier, the life that you had, you're in communication with his partner and still around who hasn't reincarnated as yourself. And can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I consider her my spirit wife, and we first connected in March 2010, March 10, 2010. And that was through a psychic medium. I actually hired two that year, but I wrote to this lady whom I'd had readings with before, and I told her very little about it, just that there was a past life I wanted to look into. And I don't even think I told her that much. I just said I wanted a reading. And she wrote back and said, no, I won't read you. And she said, the reason is that there's an attached spirit. And she says, looking at you is like looking at an image in a funhouse mirror, all distorted. So that's, well, what was happening was I was so much immersed in my past life that there's actually I'm really living two lifetimes in the same time. And that created that effect, apparently. So I explained to her a little more. I didn't want to tell her too much, So I explained to her a little more that I had this past life that I had identified, and I thought that my past life wife was trying to contact me. And she said, oh, okay, now I understand what's going on. She saw what these things were being caused by. So she said, okay, I'll read you. And then that was the reading. It was like 2:00 on March 10th. First thing she said is that I almost called you an hour earlier because I was getting bombarded with images for the last hour, which tells me that Abby really wanted to talk to me, So then we proceeded with the reading, and I took notes in real time. It wasn't recorded, but I took notes and learned quite a bit about Abby. And I also found out many years later that a lot of the stuff she said was accurate. She made a lot of hits, which I didn't know were hits because I hadn't delved into the history yet. But as I did, I was able to prove, I don't know, maybe some 10 points or something that she talked about, historical things about Abby as a person and so forth. So that was our first contact. And then I had another reading, I think it was in December of that same year. And more hits then, learned more about Abby. So I started trying to connect with her, and at some point we married, I mean, all I did was I went out to the beach at night and I put on a ring like I hear, and presumably she put one on and we were married. So our anniversary is coming up. Our 15th anniversary is coming up very soon on the 10th. And she taught me a couple different methods of communication. And one was sort of like dowsing. I would hold my hand up and hold it limp and then like my ring finger, that finger would go down, and I would try very hard not to do it myself. It's very tricky in terms of your subconscious mind influencing what you're doing. But I could get, it was like yes, no, and a prompt, or and a maybe. That was all we had. But you can play 20 questions with that. You can say, is it this, or is it this, or is it this? Prompt. Okay, it's that. And now that I know that's what you're telling me, then how about this and this? And you can dig down into, what she's trying to tell me. And I also use the prompts for things like movies. Like I would go to the library or to the store and or online, and I would say, how about this one? How about this one? And then I get a prompt. So then I go ahead and rent that movie, and it would typically the first 10 or so times we did that, it would tell me something about our relationship, you know. So she was kind of catching me up to speed, about who we were as a couple. And then she taught me telepathy, and it's just exactly like what many other people have described. People in the astral world are at a much, much higher vibration, and when they communicate with you, what you get is a burst. Uh, it's a burst of information that contains like a whole paragraph's worth of information. If you were to write it out, might take you, a minute or two, but you get it just like that. So you guys are probably familiar with that too. And what she told me was it's the opposite of the scientific usual skeptical method where you don't believe anything until it's proved. She says this is the opposite. She says you believe it at the outset and you practice. And gradually you get better, but it requires the belief to start practicing, right? So that was kind of opposite the way I normally think about things. Neil, I'm sure you're a medium, you're familiar with this. But gradually it's gotten better, to where now what I do is I sit down. I'm a fast typist. So I sit down and I just type. And she says, you have to get rolling. You have to get started to overcome the inertia kind of. So I get started typing just anything I'm thinking of. And then she starts prompting me. And I just kind of turn over. Once I get rolling, I turn it over to her and I just go prompt to prompt to prompt to prompt. And when I get to the end of it, I say, no, I didn't write that. Because she'll give me insights that I've never had before, things I wouldn't have thought of, things from a different perspective or whatever. So, and, she's been able to prove her existence to me, especially the first year or so. She did all kinds of things to prove that it was real because she knew that if I was going to make a commitment, it better be real, because I didn't want to get into no man's land where I was getting emotionally invested and I was getting involved, and yet I didn't know if it was real or not. So she, threw everything at me to make sure I understood it was real. And then what she told me, if I continued to question, I think I did it through divination, through one of Rumi's Masnavi. But what she basically told me was, I've given you enough now. If you continue to question, that's hypocrisy. She's very blunt. She says, now you've got enough, to make up your mind. And if you make up your mind, the other thing she told me was, if you make up your mind now, that goes for 6 months from now and 6 years from now. The time. So this thing where, I'm convinced now, but 3 hours from now, I'm starting to doubt. Or I'm convinced now, but 3 weeks from now, I'm starting to doubt, and I need another sign and another sign. She says, that's nonsense. What you do is if it's true now, it's true 3 weeks from now and 6 months from now. And that's a matter of personal integrity. You make the decision, I'm convinced now. Okay, it's true. Then that has to carry.
That's interesting.
Once it's proved, it's proved. I was going to say, once it's proved, it's proved, and then it's pointless to keep asking for everything to be reiterated over and over again. It's like raising the bar, sort of the fallacy. The fallacy of raising the bar. But I've never come across a case like this, Stephen. I haven't, because I'm interested in past life memories and things like that. I've been looking into it an awful lot. I know that there's many people who have them. Most commonly, young children have these memories. Very often, they lose them as they get older. But to summarize, you had a past life in which you married somebody, a woman, and you both passed away in that life. You have now come back, but you maintain a form of marriage or relationship with the spirit of this woman. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Basically, I mean, the thing that I would adjust in all of this is that we're all a spirit. None of us are a body. We just happen to be in one. But death is just dropping the outer covering. So the spirit remains the same all the way through the incarnation and during the period on the other side and then back into a body. It's the same person all the way through. So, she just happens to be a person like me who just doesn't happen to have a physical body right now.
Mm-hmm. So when you mentioned about the various techniques and, you get all the data come through, almost like a data stream of information coming through that. And I can kind of relate to that a little bit. And also the other thing you said, which was, you started to doubt things after you said, you've had the reading or whatever it was, you started out 3 hours later. And that's a common thing. It's not just yourself. I've heard and read accounts of people who have gone to physical seances where they've witnessed incredible things. And then, 3 hours down the road on their way home, they start, well, hang on, was I really speaking to my father, or was it some sort of puppet, or was it some man dressed up? And they convinced themselves by the next day that no, it was a whole false thing, and lots of people have lost out on that because there's no one there to kind of explain to them, no, you really did have that experience. So I can understand where you're coming from, and I think that, with today's technology, I've now gone to seances and things and readings, and I record these things because that way there's nothing in your mind that can make the stuff up. You've got the evidence on that recording in some way, shape, or form. It's more difficult in a seance where they're switching out the lights and that kind of thing. But certainly when you had a really good psychic reading with someone, you know that you got the evidence. And, I've had some astounding readings from people that couldn't have possibly known me or my family, over to you, Ben, anyway.
Right, yeah. I mean, this is a fascinating thing. I mean, it's I don't doubt. I mean, I know these things have a reality. Although, as I said earlier, what I normally find is that it's usually children, preschool children. Usually, just when they learn to speak, they start describing past lives. They start describing living alternative lives and things like that. And then as they grow older, these goes away. Jason Leninger is a good example of this. He actually believed he was someone in the past. He said he was a man called I forgot the name of he was a pilot in World War II. Somebody Huston. And they found out that James Houston, that's it. James Leninger, yeah, sorry, his name was James Leninger. That's why he calls himself James III, because he said that his father was called James as well. And through a lot of inquiries, his parents made inquiries. A lot of parents don't do this. They dismiss these as ravings, juvenile ravings. And usually the child gets over it after like a few years. And indeed, today, James has lost these memories. But during the time that his parents were investigating this, there's absolutely no doubt that these memories were accurate beyond what a child would know. He had knowledge that only the original James Huston would have known, the workings of World War II aircraft, things like that. In your case, Stephen, I mean, you're clearly a more mature man. When did these feelings or thoughts begin for you?
Well, I did have some childhood memories, actually. Matthew Franklin Whittier lived a lot of his life in Maine on the northern east coast of the United States. And one of the most beautiful things up there is the coast, the sea coast. There's rocks, and the sea comes pounding in on the rocks. It's really beautiful. I lived up there for 6 years. And Matthew Franklin Whittier in his writings talks about how beautiful it was. But as a little boy, I remember saying, I want to see the rocky coast of Maine, but I didn't know what Maine was. I'd never seen a rocky coast, and I didn't even know what the state of Maine was. And yet I remember that was a theme for me. I want to see the rocky coast of Maine. So that was just one example. I think there were some others, but I also, as a little boy, was longing for my soulmates. Well, so Abby, Matthew's wife, was his soulmate, not just his wife. And I remember longing for, I was a little boy and I was lying in the back seat of the car fantasizing for an hour being with my soulmate, so that I've been looking for her for a long time from little. But trying to remember some of the other things. I mean, and there are some other ones that are slipping my mind right now, but even as a little boy, I had memories of this lifetime. One of the things that I have determined, which is outrageous, is that Matthew was the real author of the poem The Raven that everybody thinks was written by Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh, what
Well,
one is Nevermore, that one.
that one, yeah, I
Nevermore.
wrote that.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
wrote that for Abby. I mean, that was written after Abby's death, about 9 months after her death. Um, but when I was in grade school, I think it's sixth grade, and they had us read that poem, I couldn't read it. I started reading it, and the feelings of grief for a soulmate just overwhelmed me. I was maybe 12 years old, something like that, you know. And I mean, when I think about it, I don't think too many boys at that age have that reaction to that poem. They probably think of it as science fiction, or it's cool, it's about a raven, it's about a big crow or something, but they don't have such overwhelming grief for a soulmate that they can't finish reading the poem. So that's another childhood example, I would say.
that's interesting because the poem is about grief. It's about grief and bereavement and things like that, and the possibility of the afterlife and things like that. It's um I see. Did you eventually get to the rocky coast of Maine?
I did.
Yeah. Did you? What did you feel? Because Matthew lived there. What did you feel when you actually saw it for the first time?
Well, I went to Portland, Maine specifically because he had lived there, and I wanted to continue my research there and go to the places that he had been, and see what kind of reactions I got. Well, I mean, what I got a lot of was emotions, not so much tangible cognitive memories. And in order to get flashbacks where you get the full cognitive memory, I think I decided that first off, it has to be exactly like it was, but secondly, there has to be a strong emotional component. So if you have those two things, you might get a flashback. Not guaranteed, but you might get one. So I went to places that were exactly as they were, but they didn't have real strong emotion attached to them. I'm talking about, very strong. And I went to places that should have had strong emotion, like Abby's grave and Matthew's grave and things like that. But they weren't, they were, different. It wasn't what I experienced in that past life. So the two things didn't come together. The only time they really came together was when I got inside Matthew's childhood home, which is the Whittier farmhouse. It's kept as a museum, and it's kept as much as possible exactly the way it was. And on the outside, it's different because it was just an old farmhouse without paint or anything, kind of sagging and whatever from the 1700s. So they fixed it all up. They completely rebuilt it, and they, painted it and everything on the outside. So when I first learned about Matthew, I was kind of disappointed. I said, I don't feel anything. I was very honest. I was always careful to be strictly honest about these things. And I said, I want to feel something. I should be feeling something, but I'm not. I'm not getting anything out of the outside pictures of this house. And even when I got there was very little that triggered memories for me on the outside. But I didn't realize that they had spruced it all up. See, so that's how precise this thing is. The only thing I remembered was there's a stream that runs in front of the house, and right now you can look at it over a guardrail, on a road, and there was a rock jutting out. And I said, when I was a boy, I squatted down on that rock and sailed leaf boats on that. Came to me. But I have no way to prove that. See, that's the problem with past life memory. If you want to prove it, not only do you have to get the accurate memory, but you have to have some way to verify. Well, that's not in the historical records anywhere. Besides, it's so generic. Every little boy with a stream has sailed a leaf boat, right? So it's useless for research. But then I got inside the house, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. Boy, did I know that place. But they had a very nice caretaker in there, and I was the only person there. So he wanted to sit down and have a long conversation. So I had to maintain. I'm having all these strong feelings, past life flashbacks. This whole thing's so familiar, but I couldn't tune into it because I had to maintain to have this conversation. So after about 10 minutes, it kind of faded, and I wasn't able to get it back. But I did have one memory, and it's a memory I can't verify because it's not anywhere in the historical record. So you have to get something that's very specific. You remember it, and then before you could ever research it, later on you find, oh, there's a record of it. He talks about it, or somebody talks about it. That's the only way to verify these things. But what it was is they have this narrow little staircase, and it's got 3 steps up and a landing, and then it goes up to the right, I think. And it's, maybe 6 feet away from the entrance to the house. And I saw it in a postcard and it hit me. I said, I had a really strong memory of when I was a boy, apparently Matthew was 6'2", so maybe he was 12 years old or 11, and he was already a pretty tall boy. He would run at full speed, put his hand on the banister, swing around, and land on that landing with his boots, whomp, like that, as a joke, and his parents would be all upset and everybody say, don't do that, Well, now I look back, and the reason they did that is I was the only able-bodied son who could do the farm work, and they didn't want me to get hurt, or they wouldn't have anybody to work on the farms.
Oh.
So that, I think, was why they were so upset. I didn't know any of that at the time. I just had this memory of being very mischievous and running, there's like a post. I put my hand on the post, swing around, push myself up, and land on that landing. And when I got there, I still had the same memory. I said, yeah, I used to do that, but can't verify it. See, so most of the things in Portland, like there's a church called the First Parish Church downtown. It's the only thing left, basically, that was the way it was when I was there. We're talking 1838, 1839, 1840. I was driving around downtown, and the street dead ends right at that church. And I looked up and I said, man, I know that. Instantly I knew it, recognized it. And I said, the only thing is, it's not supposed to be crowded in by these tall buildings like this. It's supposed to have some space around it. It felt weird for it to be crammed in like that because it was the tallest thing around at the time. So I take that as a genuine past life memory. But again, there's no way to prove that,
No, it's the thing about the. I suppose it's someone from the past did visit. They may think that because a lot of these buildings will be much newer than the church, and they'll have been built since, and they didn't exist in the past.
It was consistent. Yeah, it was.
So I suppose that a skeptic would say that's something you can surmise. However, so I know that some people in your position have come up with very, very obscure anecdotes related to their past life, which later on are uncovered and unknown, but then they are uncovered by a dedicated historian.
I had to be my own historian.
But these are things that would not be known to the person who's making the claim, which is to show these are the cases I find most interesting. Yeah.
Well, that's what I was able to do that. Not when I went to Portland, but I was able to do that before. And I would say 3, 4, 5 times. I had a lot of memories, but 3 or 4 or 5 of them were verified to that extent, which to me is enough to show that I'm dealing with a real case.
Did you ever come to any sort of reason of why you incarnated into this life now and not stay in the spirit world with your beloved?
Well, first of all, I think when Matthew died, he became earthbound for a while. I can't prove that, but I think so. And it was because of revenge, because he felt betrayed. Because when you're out of your body, you can read other people's minds. You can see their motives and their intentions, and you can read their minds. And he found that a lot of the people around him that he had trusted were actually betraying him.
Right.
Including his third wife at the time and his brother, his famous brother, and other people in different ways. I don't mean that we're necessarily taking money from him, but they were not who they seemed to be, And he stuck around to get revenge instead of letting go of it. So that's an important lesson for everybody. When you die, you got to leave it. Whatever it is, leave it and move on. Because if you continue to engage and try to get revenge, you'll get stuck. So that was one reason, I think. And as far as reincarnating, I think I had an awful lot of karma to burn off. And Abby said, I'm going to sit this one out. And not only is she going to sit it out, but she's my guide now. So she
Looking
can
for the
function
wings,
as my
so to
guide
speak.
there. Yeah, exactly. I had a lot of stuff to go through. But thirdly, I think that I incarnated to try to reclaim their literary legacy, which had been lost, and I think was quite significant. And this includes not only The Raven, but A Christmas Carol. I believe that Abby and I wrote.
I remember you telling me this in email. Yeah, around Christmas time. We're talking about this plenty. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was born on Christmas. So I think it was kind of a sign. I said, okay, I'm going to come in and I'm going to get born right on Christmas Day. And that's kind of a sign to me, So I can't prove that either. But I can prove that Charles Dickens didn't write A Christmas Carol. And I can prove to a pretty high standard that Matthew and Abby were the original authors.
My goodness, I mean, a lot of writers use ghostwriters. This is a lot of them have ghostwriters. I didn't know this, you see. So the ghostwriters, there's an attribution which the ghostwriter has. And
Well,
Matthew's
in this
never had
case,
this attribution. He's never had this attribution.
yeah, well, Matthew did do ghostwriting, and there are a few novellas that I found that he sold to people, and let them use their name. In this case, Matthew and Abby wrote it together. Abby died. Matthew met Charles Dickens in Boston when he came over and gave him the manuscript. And then Dickens took it and reworked it into a ghost story, which it wasn't. See, originally, A Christmas Carol was a spiritualist redemption novel. All of the elements were supposed to be real, all the supernatural elements, the spirits, and Marley is an earthbound spirit. I mean, if you look at that story carefully, what you'll see is the earthbound spirit is Marley. The three spirits that visit were originally spirit guides. Then there's the teaching that a higher spirit has a higher rate of vibration, that if you touch them, you may levitate. There's astral travel. There's karma. I wear the chains I forged in life. That's a principle of karma. There's a life review. There's all of these elements of authentic occultism in A Christmas Carol that Charles Dickens didn't know anything about, and he never put in any of his other stories. It couldn't have come from him. All that came from Abby Poyen Whittier, Matthew's wife. All of the occult elements originally came from Abby, and they were intended to be real.
What was the original manuscript called that he then gave over to Charles Dickens?
I don't know because I don't have it, but I would guess it was called A Christmas Carol. And one of the reasons is that they used a story, apparently, that they had written way back in the early 1830s that's very similar. They used that story almost as a template to start A Christmas Carol. And if you compare the two, you'll see where they drew elements out of it.
Right.
And that's called the New Year's Bells. And that was about New Year's. So, and Abby and Matthew together also wrote a story about Thanksgiving, which was claimed by another author. That's called Chanticleer's Thanksgiving Story of the Peabody Family. So that was primarily Abby's story. So they were writing holiday stories. So I would guess A Christmas Carol was the original title. Abby was a musician as well as being a poet. And it would have been her idea to call the chapters staves. And the reason I believe that is, first of all, as I said, she was a musical prodigy as well as being a literary prodigy. She was an excellent musician. She played harp and piano and had a fine singing voice. All of this I found in the historical record. So a stave is a musical phrase, but a stave is also can be a rung on a ladder. And this had a double meaning, and each chapter was a rung on the ladder because they conceived of this story as walking each reader vicariously through Ebenezer Scrooge's conversion, so that the end of it was a vicarious conversion for every reader. That was the idea. They really wanted to change. They wanted to uplift humanity, to have vast numbers of people read this and each one vicariously go through Scrooge's experience. And so each stave was a rung on a ladder to the conversion experience that they were trying to get each reader to. And Charles Dickens never understood this at all. He never understood that there was a double meaning to the chapters being called staves. He just kept the title and he kept that convention without knowing what it meant.
This is extraordinary because, of course, I don't know anyone who has not heard the story Christmas Carol. There's so many movie adaptations, so even if you haven't read the book, it's there for you. Everyone knows the story. You see it every Christmas. But so Matthew gave the manuscript to Charles Dickens. Did Dickens then pay him and say, "Here you go, Matthew, this is a good bit of ghostwriting you're doing for me, and here's your fee"? Or did he just say, "Well, I'll publish it under my own name and pretend it's mine"? That would be the definition of plagiarism.
We don't know. I do know that Matthew wrote Dickens a letter and that Dickens received it because his secretary sent out a canned acknowledgement to Matthew, apparently to a whole bunch of people. And it probably just said thank you for the letter, and then Dickens would sign all of these things and the secretary would send them out. So we know that Matthew wrote him. I know that Matthew was a fan of Dickens. I also know that Matthew was writing in that style before Dickens ever published anything. But so when I put everything I know together, my guess is that Matthew, who was a social activist and a philanthropist, social activist long before Dickens ever was, he saw Dickens as a social activist, as a fellow activist. And Dickens wasn't. In my opinion, it was just PR. It was just public relations, and Dickens wasn't sincere about it. But Matthew was deeply sincere about his social activism. And so he would have believed that Dickens was authentic in that regard. And he knew that he and Abby had had hoped to have vast numbers of people read this so they could elevate humanity. See? And the only way he could see to do that, now that Abby had passed on, was to trick Dickens essentially into publishing this story. That was his idea. See, so he handed it over to Dickens. He may have said, do with it as you will. But I look at that as Matthew being fooled, because Dickens wasn't sincere about the very thing that Matthew admired the most. See? So to me, it was like taking candy from a baby, especially Matthew was in grief. So when you're in grief, you do things, that you might not have done if your head was clear, right? So he handed it over to Dickens, being fooled as to who Dickens really was. And in grief, he probably said something like, do with it as you see fit. So I think that Matthew was pleased when Dickens published it, in the sense that he had pulled off this plan. But later on, I think maybe he didn't even really read it at first, but he realized that Dickens had really dumbed it down severely. He'd secularized it and kind of sensationalized it and commercialized it to the extent that it was kind of a mixed bag as to whether it was a good thing or not. But the spiritual power in that, and the authentic occult teachings that are still in there, are powerful enough to have had a pretty strong impact even so.
Oh yes, definitely, no doubt about
Yeah,
it.
we saw the film adaptation that was done in 1971, I think, or 1970, with Albert Finney playing Scrooge. We saw it on Netflix or Amazon Prime just around the Christmas time, because we were watching Christmas movies, and it was a great movie. And it was, of course, it wasn't all this PC stuff now. It had, there was songs. I don't like musicals, but we kind of enjoyed that. But generally, it was a good story. And I kind of really felt that it upheld a lot of kind of spiritualist principles and things, but you didn't kind of realize it until afterwards when you analyze it. And it was a really, really good story. And it's a shame that story was kind of stolen from him. I know that he handed it over to him, but it's like he got no credit whatsoever for it. It's a shame.
Yeah, and later on, if he had been so inclined, nobody would have believed him anyway. So
yeah.
So, would you like to, in a sense, redeem the identity or the memory of Matthew, and say, well, this was, maybe give him credit to give him credit for what he'd done? Would you like that, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's getting back to why Incarnated. I think that was a big part of why Incarnated. And there's another consideration, and that is that, I have a master's in counseling, as I mentioned, and I can make a strong case that Charles Dickens was actually a sociopath, psychopath. It was all fake, everything that looks like compassion and concern for the poor and the whole, and religion, all of it was borrowed from other people. That was part of what because he didn't just plagiarize from Matthew, he stole from a whole bunch of people. And so he knew to steal from people who had those human qualities, and then he would sensationalize it. And the combination was very, very popular, because I think people in Victorian times, they knew they were supposed to be reading moral literature, but a lot of people really wanted, that grit, and grime, and the murder, and all the horrible things. They wanted to read about that stuff, but they wanted to have their conscience clear, so that they could say, oh, I'm reading moral fiction. See?
Yeah.
So Dickens supplied that market, because he took the stories that were from moral writers, but then he jazzed them up and put, spice in them, and sensationalized them, so that people would want to read them, and they still felt like it was okay to read them. See? So it was a formula for financial success for him. But the point that I was getting to was that Dickens is now being revealed as a scoundrel by academics, and it started with the affair that they discovered he had with an 18-year-old actress. And then they went further into it and found that he was really quite cruel to his wife, and even tried to have her put in an insane asylum when she was quite sane. Yeah. So, I mean, it gets worse and worse. And it's going to get a lot worse. There was a book published Halloween before last called The Life and Lies of Charles Dickens by Helena Kelly. And it goes beyond his relationship with women, because what scholars have tried to do is say, okay, he wasn't so good with women, but they kind of tried to corral it. They tried to create a firewall between Dickens' life, between that part of Dickens' life and the rest of it. They said, oh, well, he was a wonderful human being, except he just wasn't good with women, see? So, but it's not working, because people like Helena Kelly are saying, well, he wasn't such a good person over here and over here and over here also, see? Like he may have spent an awful lot of time with prostitutes, for example, and may have gotten syphilis and may have, So, I mean, it goes on like that. So I think it gets even worse myself. And I've written a lengthy paper making this case from the historical record, as well as making the case that Matthew and Abby were the original authors. But I think even if my research is ignored, these other people are gradually going to expose him. So now the problem is, and supposedly he wrote this within 6 weeks when he was in debt, when he needed, or almost in debt, and he desperately needed money. He wrote A Christmas Carol in 6 weeks. Well, he didn't do that. He revised it within 6 weeks to make quick cash because he was almost in debt. See, which makes a lot more logical sense when you think about it.
Yeah. You can't write. I mean, I know he was very prolific, and he's allegedly very, very a bit of a workaholic. But 6 weeks, you could
not
in 6
like
weeks.
that. Yeah. See, so he didn't. So, but the thing is, as long as people believe he was the author, then they're going to have to say that this guy that was cruel to his wife and tried to have her put in an insane asylum and had this affair. Dickens even basically told his wife, you have to go and meet with my new sexual partner. She had to go and meet with this young actress because Dickens told her to do it, just because he was mean.
That sounds like one of his own villains, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. He's not a nice guy. Well, when this comes out and people still believe that he wrote A Christmas Carol, there's going to be a lot of confusion. And I think a lot of moral confusion, because A Christmas Carol is obviously an inspired work. But if this scoundrel could dash off this thing in 6 weeks for quick cash, then there's no such thing as inspired work. See, then anybody that's good enough as a writer can fake it. And I think that creates a certain a moral confusion that's going to be a real problem in the future. So I feel like I'm trying to head that off at the pass. I'm trying to get my idea out there that Dickens was not really the author before he gets really thoroughly exposed.
He wasn't Jack the Ripper by any stretch of the imagination later on.
He wasn't, but I think he drove his sister-in-law to suicide.
Really?
By either raping her or seducing her. Yeah. When he got married, Catherine Hogarth's younger sister, Mary Hogarth, came to live with them. And then all of a sudden she develops some mysterious illness and dies in his arms. And then he was an actor. So but actors in that day overacted, So he kicked it into overdrive and overacted his horrible platonic grief and love for this girl, which he really hadn't expressed before. And he had to have like a lock of her hair put in a ring, and he never would take the ring off, even to wash his hands hardly. And he went on and on and on. And he also commandeered her grave so nobody else could get near it. Okay. So I think what was happening, because a psychopath has two different people, the real person and the fake person, running at the same time. So you see the fake one, but the other one is always there. See, and he has totally different motives for what he's doing. So I think what happened is that he either raped her or seduced her, and she killed herself probably with arsenic.
Bloody hell.
And then to cover for himself, he had to do the exact opposite of, he had to put on a great show of his platonic love, but then he had to get control of his grave so nobody could exhume it and test her, because they did have the ability, I think it was 1837, to test for arsenic. See? So that's what I think went down. And I mentioned it to a couple people in the Dickens world who nobody's ever thought of this, which blows my mind. But here's the thing. Dickens had a certain way of talking when he was lying. He got theatrical. He got overblown. He got, he put on this show, see? And he's been caught lying using that kind of language when he denied his affair. It's called the violated letter. That's what scholars call it. And the first thing he says in it was that his separation from his wife, Catherine, was mutual and harmonious. It was amicable. And it wasn't. He put her away, and literally divided the house up and put her in the other half of the house, and put her away and forced her to go meet her replacement and so on. He was quite cruel about it. So that was all a lie. And then the other part was about how he saw this young woman that somebody had said these horrible things about being as pure as his own daughters or something. In other words, he way overacted. And we know it's all a lie. The whole thing was a lie, So if that was what he sounds like when he lies, he used the same kind of overacting with regard to Mary Hogarth's death. He used the same kind of overacting when he pretended to explain how he wrote A Christmas Carol. It's a pattern. And once you see that pattern, and logically, okay, he was definitely lying here with this kind of language. And now he's using that kind of language here, and he's using it here. Well, he's probably lying in the other instances also. So it's just logic, So when that comes out, I mean, the poop is going to hit the fan, when that comes out. I'm trying to think of what can I say on a podcast,
We can say that. We can say all this.
You can say that. Yeah, the shit hits the fan. So the shit is going to hit the fan, And then, like I said, the people that are protecting Dickens have created this firewall. And they say, well, everybody has a dark side. And some, Victorian men weren't really very good with women and so on. And they're trying to hold the line there. It's not going to hold. It's already been breached.
So when it comes to the reincarnation, do you believe this is you mentioned this was the reason you reincarnated as Stephen in today's world?
One of them.
Yeah. Does this happen obviously a lot? Because I mean, there's different ideas about reincarnation, and some are that you literally do choose who you are. I mean, Robert Newton wrote the book Destiny of Souls and Journey of Souls, these two books, which they become bestsellers, they become very famous, where he does describe literally people in the spirit world picking lives almost as you would choose a trip from a holiday brochure. And some of these lives are full of hardship, and some of them because the soul needs to learn something, and they need to develop, and the hardship, the adversity is what gives them strength. But others are there to right some wrong, to be essentially a healer, to be a healer beyond themselves.
Right.
Is this a regular thing? Is it a common occurrence, do you think?
I think so. My interpretation of that is that it's like college, where a freshman might not have too many choices for electives. They've got the required courses, but once you're a senior, you can choose quite a number of electives. So I'm guessing as somebody grows spiritually, that they have more choices in terms of what they're going to reincarnate. But the other thing that came to mind was about the case of Jenny Coquelle, who you may be familiar with. She's in you guys' country. And she reincarnated because in her past life, she had lost touch with her children. She died and her children were scattered about, and she wanted to find her children, which she literally did. There's pictures of her with one or two of her past life children, who now, of course, are like elderly men, but she was able to do that. And the Shanti Devi case is somewhat similar. She came back to be with her husband, who turned out wasn't faithful to her, but that was her motivation. So there are cases where people have some unfinished business, something overriding thing that they feel they need to come back to get straight. I don't think it's all that common, but there are cases like that.
Mm. Do you think it's possible? Sorry, I'm getting over a cold here. Do you think it's possible that Charles Dickens, I'm sure it would be possible, would actually reincarnate as well? Because I've heard that people can reincarnate from, say, the Victorian times, and then they've got unfinished business together in, say, the 21st century. So yourself coming through as Stephen, Charles Dickens comes through as someone else, and you might have meetings with them and not realize it, but you have like battles or something,
It's possible. I don't have any indication of that, as I sit here, but it's certainly possible.
Mm. This is the basis of the film. I believe it was a book as well, Cloud Atlas.
Yeah,
which is it's a brilliant film about the different people do actually literally over a 500-year period from the past into the present into the future keep sharing each other's lives in different roles and different ways to essentially to help each other or to right wrongs or to things like that. It's a really, really good story. That's I mean, you mentioned that when you saw a picture of Matthew, you thought I was like looking in the mirror. He looks like you. Is that regular? So, for example, does everyone reincarnate as someone similar? Is everyone the same sex, for example, or can women reincarnate as men and vice versa? Because I know someone actually who's a woman who's she's very feminine, she's heterosexual, but she describes herself as a male soul, and she even made a film about a sort of semi-autobiographical film about her past life as this man. What do you believe about that, Stephen?
Well, I do know that people switch sexes. My impression is that you'll go for a number of lifetimes at one sex and then you'll flip over. And the incarnation where you flip over can be kind of awkward because, like you say, you feel like the previous sex eternally, you know.
I mean, this person is, she said that 95+% of her incarnations are male, but she is experiencing one of her rare female incarnations at the moment.
That makes sense. Yes, that makes sense. I think that my most recent one was probably female, and I've extrapolated from my impressions and memories a lot about this person, but I can't identify her in history. So, it's kind of on hold, but I think that I was a woman.
Can people reincarnate, in your view, as, and I know this is an old idea, in fact it's many thousands of years old, people can actually reincarnate as different species. They can come back as a different animal of some kind. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, it's common. My understanding is that it's rare to go backwards, very rare. It may happen on rare occasions for some reason or other, but typically, the soul apparently has gradually progressed through the evolutionary kingdom. So once you reach the human form, you don't really go back. Not commonly, anyway.
That's like in that book, the Art of Racing in the Rain. I don't know if you've read that. It's a charming book about it. It's a family drama where the first person narrator is the family dog. And in the end, he dies and comes back as a human. It's just really good.
It reminded me, actually, what you're just saying there, Ben. Now, there was Jane Roberts, the writer from, I'm trying to think, Elmira in New York, in the state of New York. She was a medium in the 70s, well, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Died in 1984, I think, aged about 53, 52, something like that. And her husband, Robert Butts, who used to write it down in the notes, she used to channel this entity, or, most people would call it a spirit guide, but he described himself, Seth, that was the being that she used to channel, initially made contact through an Ouija board as a previous life called Frank Withers. And then after about 6 or 7 sessions, he said, I would actually prefer to use my, other version of myself, which is Seth. And he started to speak through Jane Roberts in a channeled trance-like condition. But during one of the many, many sessions that they would write and they were eventually published as books, he actually said that in a previous lifetime that he'd actually, it's actually whilst he was there as Seth in the spirit world, if you like, he was also partially incarnated as a dog on Earth, and that would be sometime in the 1970s. And so whilst his consciousness existed over there, he expressed a tiny portion of his consciousness to share the body of a dog with a dog consciousness. And I suppose an analogy might be that if for instance, you're an observer of a garden and you go over to look at a bee on a flower, your consciousness is projected towards the consciousness of the bee, and maybe at some subtle thing you're merging to a small point with the bee. Maybe. Can't say it's absolutely true, but it's an analogy, maybe not a brilliant one. But he was saying that he projected his consciousness and shared it so he could get the life experience of what it was like to be a dog. And obviously it lived to maybe, 10, 12, 13, 14, something, and then it eventually died. And they kind of forgot all about it. It was many, many years later, they said, oh, you mentioned to us in one session that you were sharing your consciousness with the dog. And he goes, yeah, that's right. But now the dog has since died. So that kind of job is now done, sort of thing. So it's just, even whilst he's over there, he's still sending out portions of his own consciousness to sort of see what life is like as certain things, whether it's humans or indeed animals. So I thought I'd just throw that in as an interesting point. Yeah.
Another thing, I'll come back to Stephen, but I just want to mention this as a part of what you're saying. I'd love to get what Stephen thinks of this. Dolores Cannon. Now, one of the most extraordinary books I've ever read was The Convoluted Universe Part 2. Dolores was I met Dolores, actually. She spoke at Probe once, along with her daughter who was there. Her technique was very unusual. She would not go into trance herself, but she used to hypnotize people and put them into trance. And they would then describe alternative lives. Now, these lives were not necessarily past lives. They were lives almost it reminds me a little bit of Robert Monroe's Locale 3, the very sometimes very surreal surroundings. And I'll never forget, in one of the sessions, she hypnotized a woman who then went into trance and began speaking in a way she never normally would. So, for example, this was a woman who was not of a high intelligence and education, and tended to speak using quite simple language. Yet when she was in trance, she would suddenly start using, I would say, speaking in a way that was above her the level of intelligence and sophistication that she had as a person. And would describe like being a robot on an alien planet and things like that. I mean, I don't know what you think about that, Stephen. I'd love to know.
Well, I don't know. I've heard of Dolores Cannon, but I don't know very much about her. And a case like that, I mean, there could be any number of explanations. I'm trying to remember the name. There was a psychic in the 19th century who did basically the same thing. He was uneducated, but under hypnosis, he suddenly became quite erudite, and functioned at a much higher, academic level than normal. So did that open up abilities from past lives? Did it open up certain native capacities in him, or was there a spirit that was guiding him? There's a number of different explanations for something like that. So I wouldn't know which was which,
Well, that's true. I mean, again, it's unprovable, but I thought it was a very, very interesting book. A very interesting book indeed.
Well, I mean, there isn't this much proof in it that if the person really was, if it can be shown that the person really did not have much of an education and did not function at that level, and all of a sudden he does, what are our explanations? Well, normal explanations. Well, he could have been coached. If you can prove that he wasn't coached, then there's something supernatural going on. We don't know what it is, but it's definitely not normal.
Yeah, I was saying that Matthew in his previous life attended seances, but he went there with Abby. Is that right?
No, it was after she passed on.
Oh, that's right. To try and contact.
Yeah. What I know about is that he kept up a correspondence with the editor of a spiritualist newspaper, and he acted as the agent for a spiritualist newspaper, and he was a signer on the 1854 petition to the United States Congress by spiritualists. Right. It was like 13,000 signatures or something like that, and he's on there. But I also know that he was a member of the Portland Spiritualist Association, and that at one point there was a committee formed from that association. He was an officer. I know he was an officer in that group. And there was a committee of maybe 5 or 6 men that formed to scientifically study physical mediumship. So Matthew probably wrote the article, but they went to a number of seances and they observed phenomena, lights, instruments being played in the air, without anybody playing them, and, hands touching and so forth. And Matthew wrote it all up, and they all signed it. And he signed with his real name, which he almost never did. But he signed M.F. Whittier to this. So we know that in 1855, he was scientifically investigating physical mediumship, and they made a point that they had looked at the whole area carefully and tried to eliminate any normal explanations and so on.
Bereavement is actually often an inspiration for things like this. I mean, some people can suddenly develop an interest for obvious reasons when they lose a loved one. I mean, a good example of this is Bob Bigelow, a current example. He's now got this BIX, this afterlife investigation project that he's working on with Leslie Kane, which when previously they only were interested in UFOs. But all right, yes. So losing Abby made him, I suppose. it's understandable that you feel comfort from that after losing Abby.
She was, first of all, she was trying to teach him these things.
Mm.
And early on, when he was in his late teens and early 20s, he ridiculed publicly in print. He would make fun of astrology and prescient dreams. I think Abby was psychic. I think she really was having prescient dreams, and he would try to make fun of them as a skeptic. Gradually, he was brought around, and he became a follower of Manuel Swedenborg, and then he got into spiritualism. About the time that he wrote The Raven, which was December of 1841, she had died in March, he believed intellectually, but it wasn't strong enough to withstand grief, of losing a soulmate. So that's why he wrote The Raven. I think what happened is that he was up late at night and he was studying her library. He was reading in her occult library, and he read a book that had two things in it. One was about animal signs, and the other thing was about manifestations, a spirit manifesting. And he wants it to happen, and he's skeptical and he's afraid of it. All those things are going on at the same time because his faith isn't really quite locked in. So he thinks he hears. I mean, the whole introduction to The Raven was literal. That was autobiography for Matthew. He literally experienced everything in that poem up to the point of The Raven. So he opens the door, he hears something, he opens the door, there's nothing there. Then his skepticism kicks in, just like we talked about. He starts to doubt. And when he doubted, he did what he used to do, which was to write a parody. He wrote a satire. That poem is a satire on the occult teaching of animal signs. So what he does is he created an animal sign that comes in and tries to convince him against the reality of life after death, as a parody of what he'd just been reading.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I thought that the Raven was just kind of like speaking cryptically, or just the narrators are imagining it. Nevermore.
Nevermore. You'll never see her. Nevermore.
He keeps repeating the
voice
nevermore.
of skepticism. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's your plans now, Stephen, for your future in the research areas of reincarnation and everything?
Well, I'm laying low because of the political situation in the United States. I don't want to get identified. I don't want my Social Security pulled. So I'm really not doing much of anything right now. People are reading my papers. I have like a little bit over 50 papers posted on Academia EDU under my name, Stephen Sakellarios, and people are reading those. And what Abby told me is, you lay low, let the papers do the work. That's what I feel like she's instructed me to do. So I'm just hiding out for the time being. And I do occasionally write to professors or authors, or writers directly. And I almost never hear back. It's amazing. I've written to hundreds and hundreds of people, including scholars, but that's also reporters and writers. They don't write back. They pretend that if they ignore me, I'll go away, but they all know that the irony of the thing is they all know because I've written to each one of them. So every single one of them knows, but not a single one of them will write to me. So the papers are hopefully doing the work, because I can see on my stats on Academia EDU, like one paper I've got that doesn't talk about one of these famous cases. It's got 11,611 people have seen that paper so far, and nobody writes to me, But the one about A Christmas Carol is I think it's over 2,000 or 3,000 now.
Right.
So that's
how can people read those papers if they're interested to look into this?
Well, they can get to my website, which is www.ial.goldthread.com, and the information is there as to how to see the papers. Okay. Or they can go to Academia EDU, which is just www.academia.edu, and put in my name. They may have to join. It won't cost them anything, but they may have to do a membership. I'm not sure.
I'm a member. It's free. Yeah, I've read a few papers on there.
Yeah, so you put my name in there and you'll get all that stuff.
Cool.
Right.
Excellent.
I know we're sort of finishing it, but you said something that is concerning. Do you believe there is essentially political oppression now in the United States against what you're saying, because you have to lie low and things like that?
Well, I'm talking about Charles Dickens as a sociopath.
Right.
And he had the same personality disorder as the current head of our country. So, so when I talk about why do I think Charles Dickens was a sociopath, and I lay it out, it could be dangerous, if there's any crossover. So, it's like asking, it's like trying to do an interview with somebody in Russia, and they say, well, it's like that here. It's getting dangerous. So I don't know, but I'm on Social Security, and I have some savings, but I'm on Social Security, and I really don't want my monthly income pulled. So and Abby has told me to lay low for a while. What she told me, this is interesting. She tells me a little bit about the future sometimes, and I think it's okay with her because I'm in tune with her now. But what she told me before the election, the recent election, she said it's going to get very bad, but it'll be over fairly quickly.
What is that?
Don't argue with the wife. Never argue with the wife. No.
Well, wherever they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, dear.
Yeah. Get very bad in the sense, but it'll.
She didn't clarify. Clarify. She deliberately didn't clarify. Said she, but I didn't know what it meant because nothing had happened yet. So she said it's going to get very bad, but then it'll be over fairly quickly. Yeah, that's all I know.
What you just told me there reminds me of a story that we had from someone who came on the Paranormal Peep Show a couple of years ago, and he told us about his friend called Dave, who is a bus driver here in the UK. I think he's probably retired by now. But this guy, Dave, was very, very psychic. And apparently this guy would see spirits and all sorts of things. And there was one particular time that this guy had gone to bed and he was sort of trying to get to sleep, but he kept getting a nudging voice saying, go downstairs, go downstairs. And he said, oh, please let me sleep. And they said, no, please go downstairs. So this guy was kind of like cajoled into going downstairs into his living room, and he could see that the door was ajar and a blue light was coming from it. So he thought, oh, it must be a street lamp or something like that coming through the curtains. So he went in there, and allegedly, I'm not saying this is the absolute truth, but this is the way it was told to me. Allegedly, he went in there and there was 3 tall beings in his living room. Wow. One was standing up, and he probably reached the ceiling. The other 2 were sitting down, but they almost looked like wizards in robes or something. That was the kind of description. And they said, thank you for coming here. The spokesman was standing up, and I forget what his name was now. Thank you for coming here, but we've got something very important to tell you. They said things are going to get very, very bad, but you're not to get too involved with people. Don't worry about people. We know you care for people, but please don't get too involved. And they said things are going to get very, very bad in America. They said, and whatever happens there will reflect over here, kind of thing. The same kind of problems that happen here. Now, they said, please don't worry too much about people. So at the time, that was just before the COVID pandemic. And I kind of thought, well, maybe it's something to do with that, although it didn't really resonate really strongly. But now I'm wondering, with all this kind of Ukraine thing and all the elections, maybe the way it's going now, literally, it might actually, what you're saying with Abby, what she's told you, almost reflects what this guy was told.
She's told exactly the same thing. Not to get involved in the state, or just to interesting. Not to get too tangled in it. Yeah. And very interesting. Yeah.
Time will tell. I mean, the future is never certain. We can always change. But time will tell. Yeah. It's
I think we're better call it a quits now, Ben.
It's been interesting. Stephen, thanks very much. It's been interesting hearing your story. Yeah, that's a pretty unique story, one I've never heard before. But Neil, thank you very much as well for co-hosting.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you, Stephen, for taking part in this dual program experience. So it's been on 2 shows at once. So you're certainly laying low.
I'll tell my listeners not to tell anyone. All right,
but
guys.
We can blank out your face. We can blank out your face, and we'll misspell your name. How about that?
Well, you know what? People just think I'm a fool, and that is the best protection there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, go with the Jester identity. I think that's probably the way to do it. Yeah, you'll be safe. All right, but thank you very much once again. Thank you, Ben, and that's our channel. Goodbye.
All right.
you.